When we discuss how to save fuel using Mars's atmosphere directly, there are two maneuvers at the forefront of this discussion: aerobraking and aerocapture. This presentation will go over what they are, how they work, and whether or not we can feasibly implement them in a crewed mission to Mars. As a basic breakdown, aerobraking is when you dip into Mars's atmosphere to lower the orbit of a spacecraft, essentially taking advantage of the drag force to slow us down instead of having to rely on fuel to do so. Aerocapture is a more extreme version of this concept. The difference between the two is that aerobraking occurs only when a spacecraft is already orbiting Mars in a capture orbit, while aerocapture is used to get the spacecraft in the capture orbit by lowering its escape trajectory.
Consider the energy of a spacecraft in orbit around Mars. We know that at any point along the orbit, the total energy of the spacecraft is some combination of kinetic and potential energy. At the periapsis, the spacecraft is traveling the fastest, meaning that most of its energy is in the form of kinetic energy, which is given by Ke equals 1/2 mv squared, where v squared is the squared velocity of the spacecraft. At the apoapsis, the spacecraft is traveling the slowest, meaning most of its energy is in the form of potential energy, which is equal to mgh, where h is the height above the center of mass of the planet. During an aerobrake maneuver, a rocket lowers its periapsis such that it is in the top of the Martian atmosphere. As the spacecraft passes through the atmosphere, it is slowed down by the drag of the atmosphere. In physics terms, the velocity, v, in the Ke equals 1/2 mv squared is reduced. This means that the total energy of the spacecraft is also reduced, meaning it won't have the energy to swing all the way back up to its original apoapsis, and will settle at a lower apoapsis, thus lowering the orbit. The rocket can then either fire its engine to boost its periapsis out of the atmosphere, or swing back around for another aerobraking pass to further lower its orbit. For an aerocapture, exactly the same dynamics apply, but with a hyperbolic orbit. Hyperbolic orbits sound scary, but they're really pretty simple. A good way to think of them is as an open orbit. Rockets approaching Mars before being captured into an elliptical orbit are on hyperbolic orbits. The same energy principles apply, with the periapsis being the place of the largest kinetic energy. To aerocapture, a rocket on a hyperbolic approach lowers its periapsis into the Martian atmosphere. As it passes through the atmosphere, it must lose enough kinetic energy in the form of velocity that it is traveling slow enough to be captured into an elliptical orbit. This requires losing significantly more kinetic energy than on an aerobrake. This means that an aerocapture requires a spacecraft to dip further into the atmosphere than on an aerobrake. You can think of an aerocapture as a more extreme version of an aerobrake. Direct entries are a specific subset of aerocapture, and result in the spacecraft shutting off so much speed in the atmosphere that it doesn't even enter orbit, instead landing after entry.
There are substantial fuel savings in using aerobraking and aerocapture. With aerobraking, the Mars Global Surveyor managed to save over 1,200 meters per second of delta V. Although aerocapture has never been used in spaceflight, Zubrin estimates that it will cut the entire delta V budget of a Mars mission by as much as 25%. A 25% reduction in fuel requirements means more room for cargo. One notable problem with aerobraking is that it's a long process. The Magellan mission to Venus was the first probe to use aerobraking, and its aerobrake took 75 days since it used dozens of orbits. The aerobrake to lower the Mars Global Surveyor took 4 months. For a manned mission, the fuel savings would not be worth the extra time of being exposed to radiation and weightlessness. However, aerobraking could be feasibly used for cargo missions to resupply a Mars base or to lower relay satellites into orbit. Aerocapture is much faster because it only requires one pass, and it doesn't require the spacecraft to have already burned into elliptical capture orbit. Most crewed missions architectures don't involve direct entry for a manned mission given the unpredictability of the Martian atmospheric conditions, leaving us with aerocapture, which would leave the spacecraft in a low orbit over Mars. Although the principles behind aerocapture are fairly simple, the prospect is by no means trivial. While direct entry has been used to land the Curiosity and Perseverance rovers, the standard aerocapture has never actually been used in a mission to Mars. This is simply because aerocapture is hard.
So to take a look at why aerocapture is so hard, let's look at a few simulations of a spacecraft attempting it in the video game Kerbal Space Program. The simulation attempts aerocapture for the game's equivalent of Mars. They call it Duna. Duna in Kerbal Space Program has a very similar atmospheric composition to Mars, so although the simulation won't be exactly accurate, it's the closest we can get given our resources.
The first difficulty is aerodynamic stress and heating. Studies have placed a target entry velocity for an aerobrake at Mars at between 8 and 10 kilometers per second. Although Mars' atmosphere is far thinner than on Earth, traveling through any medium at those velocities will result in stress and heating on the spacecraft. Mars landing vehicles will have to be able to withstand between 5 and 8 Gs of aerodynamic force during an aerocapture, and temperatures of up to 2100 degrees Celsius. In a way, this is good. If the spacecraft wasn't subject to these extreme aerodynamic forces, we would have no way of slowing down. However, it also means that the ship will need immense thermal protection in an aerodynamic design. Most aerobraking designs include a massive heat shield and a protective shell for the spacecraft. Another difficulty is the low margin for error. The landing vehicle must enter the Aerocapture at precisely the right angle or it risks losing control or burning up. Studies place the safety margin for this entry angle at less than 1 degree. This angle of attack needs to be maintained throughout the entirety of the Aerocapture or the spacecraft could burn up. Also, the entry height must be just right. Too low and the ship will burn up in the atmosphere or lose so much velocity that it never enters orbit and unintentionally performs a direct entry. Too high, and the ship could skip off the atmosphere, not losing enough speed to be captured by Mars. Remember, an aerocapture is conducted from a hyperbolic orbit. There are no second chances. Not losing enough velocity during the maneuver means an extended stay in interplanetary space. Spacecraft are also difficult to control during an aerocapture. Due to the extreme stresses placed in the spacecraft during aerocapture, losing control of the spacecraft is a concerning possibility. A landing vehicle will need some way of controlling its trajectory through the aerocapture, all while traveling at hypersonic speeds. Air brakes and thrusters could work, similar to how SpaceX guides their Falcon 9 boosters back home.
Although all the previous problems are difficult, they are fundamental engineering problems that smart people can potentially solve with knowledge of all the variables. The biggest barrier to aerocapture is its dependence on partially unknown variables. Mars' atmospheric pressure varies by season due to CO2 outgassing in ways that are not fully understood. There is also the unpredictability of dust storms. Aerocapture requires such precise fine-tuning of variables discussed above that even slight variations from the accepted values of atmospheric height, pressure, or composition could result in the spacecraft seriously diverting from its planned trajectory.
As we just saw, although aerobraking and aerocapture offer enticing and non-trivial fuel savings, there are varying degrees of usefulness. Aerobraking may be used by resupply vessels or other unmanned vehicles through lowering their orbits without any fuel expenditure. So one theoretical example is timed resupply vessels that lower their orbits on pace with ground-based needs. However, in regards to crewed flight, given the timescales involved, it's pretty unlikely that aerobraking would serve any practical purpose. And as for aerocapture, the question of whether it'll be useful for a mission to Mars is more tricky. As it stands, aerocapture with a crewed mission is probably too risky, especially for an organization as risk-averse as NASA. Zubrin thinks that aerocapture will be an essential part of crewed flight to Mars down the road, but he also concedes its difficulties. As was seen in numerous failed attempts in the simulation, aerocapture is extraordinarily difficult to get right, especially on only one try, which is all a crewed mission really has. If NASA does decide that aerocapture for a crewed vessel is mission critical, steps will need to be taken to prepare for such a maneuver. Satellites currently orbiting around Mars should continue to gather data on the Martian atmosphere, essentially reducing the number of unknown parameters, all of which could pose a very serious risk when attempting a maneuver like aerocapture. Like with the Apollo missions that came before it, unmanned missions should be planned to test the technologies and procedures of an aerocapture. It's an extremely risky maneuver, as I already said, particularly since human lives are at stake if we get it wrong. So if we want to use it, we had best know those risks inside out and thoroughly prepare for them.